Hi, it's nice to have you here. Today's episode focuses on 7 stories where someone's own stupidity became the biggest danger they faced. From a woman who thought she was following criminals, to a fisherman who refused to let the seas change his plans, only to discover the trip home would be far worse than the one out. It was September 18, 2016. A warm, late summer afternoon settled over Plano, Texas, as families spent the weekend running errands, visiting parks, and enjoying the final hours before the new week began. Deborah Boone was 54. She lived alone and spent a lot of time keeping up with local community groups online. She paid close attention to neighborhood crime reports, suspicious person posts, and the kinds of stories that spread quickly across social media. Over time, she developed a habit of looking for things that seemed out of place. To her, being observant was a good thing. It seems that she likely believed she could see connections that other people didn't. That afternoon, while running errands, Deborah noticed a white cargo van parked near a playground. There wasn't anything unusual about it. Vans like that are literally everywhere. But about 20 minutes later, she spotted what she believed was the same van several miles away near another residential area. That immediately caught her attention. A few minutes later, Deborah saw the van again near a walking trail that connected several neighborhoods. It remained parked for a short time before pulling away. Not long after that, she noticed it near a small shopping center. Deborah began watching the van more closely. She noticed it moving slowly through neighborhoods. She saw it stop briefly near a few streets before continuing on. None of those things was particularly suspicious on their own, but Deborah had already started building a theory. Instead of continuing with her errands, she followed. At first, it may have felt harmless.
I was thinking maybe she simply wanted to see where the van was going, or maybe she wanted to confirm whether her suspicions were justified. Whatever the reason, she kept going.
The van continued moving between different parts of the city. Sometimes it stopped briefly. Other times it pulled into parking lots before leaving again a few minutes later. To most people, it would have looked like a vehicle moving between work assignments. To Deborah, it looked like something else entirely. The longer she followed it, the more convinced she became that she was onto something. After about half an hour, her only goal was to keep the van in sight. Eventually, the vehicle entered a busier section of roadway where maintaining visual contact became more difficult. Every time another vehicle moved between her and the van, Deborah adjusted her position to keep it visible ahead of her. As the van passed through an intersection, Deborah followed a few seconds behind. Her attention remained fixed on keeping the vehicle in sight as it continued down the road. At the same time, cross-traffic had already begun moving through the intersection. By the time she realized another vehicle was entering her path, she had no time left to avoid a collision. The impact struck the side of Deborah's vehicle with enough force to send it spinning across the roadway before it finally came to rest near the intersection. Several motorists immediately stopped and called for help. Traffic camera footage, phone location data, and witness statements showed that Deborah had spent roughly 30 minutes following the same white cargo van through several parts of the city. The occupants were later identified as utility contractors traveling between routine service locations, and investigators found no evidence of criminal activity or suspicious behavior. Deborah died from severe injuries sustained in the collision, and the case was ultimately ruled an accident. Looking for a crime that didn't exist turned an ordinary afternoon into a tragedy. For the next story, several insurance payouts would slowly convince a man that bigger risks always came with bigger rewards. It was February 11th, 2017. A cold winter night settled over Springfield, Missouri, where quiet residential streets sat under clear skies and freezing temperatures. Most people had already retreated indoors for the evening, leaving the neighborhood largely silent by the time darkness fully settled in. Keen Halstead was 47 and had spent much of his adult life looking for shortcuts. Whenever there was an easier way to make money, he usually convinced himself it was worth pursuing.
I wish I could say otherwise, but financial problems seemed to follow him from one stage of life to the next. Instead of addressing them directly, Keen often looked for ways around them.
Over the years, he had filed several insurance claims that always seemed to work out in his favor. A stolen item here, water damage there, a damaged vehicle that resulted in a payout larger than expected. None of the incidents was ever proven fraudulent, but each successful claim reinforced the same lesson. Over time, success became its own form of encouragement. By early 2017, money had become a problem once again. As bills and debt mounted, Keen started looking at his house differently. It was the most valuable thing he owned, and eventually an idea began taking shape. Over the following weeks, Keen quietly removed a number of valuables from the house. Then, late that evening, while alone inside, he started a fire in one area of the home. At first, everything appeared manageable. The goal wasn't simply to start a fire. He wanted enough damage to support a substantial insurance claim. Before leaving, he remained inside for a few extra minutes to make sure the fire had taken hold. He wanted to be certain it would continue spreading after he was was gone. Smoke slowly began spreading through portions of the house. The fire was growing, but it still seemed controlled. He had expected smoke. He had expected flames. As far as he could tell, everything was progressing according to plan.
I can understand why he thought he had time, but he had completely underestimated how quickly conditions inside of a burning structure could change.
As the fire expanded into additional rooms, smoke thickened throughout the house. Visibility began deteriorating. Hallways that had been clear only minutes earlier became increasingly difficult to see through. The air grew hotter, and breathing became noticeably harder. When Keene finally attempted to leave, the situation had already moved beyond his control. The fire had spread faster than he anticipated, and smoke had filled much of the house before he could safely get out. Familiar rooms became disorienting as visibility disappeared. Even inside his own home, it became difficult to determine the safest route out. The longer he remained inside, the worse the conditions became. Every breath brought more smoke into his lungs. Visibility dropped to almost nothing. The heat continued building as the fire consumed additional parts of the structure. Outside, neighbors eventually noticed smoke and flames coming from the property and called for help. By the time responders arrived, large portions of the home were already burning. Keene never made it outside. After the fire was extinguished, investigators began examining what remained of the house. The scene quickly raised questions. Several valuable items that would normally be expected inside the residence were missing. Burn patterns suggested the fire had not started accidentally, and financial records revealed significant debt in the months leading up to the incident. Investigators also uncovered a history of previous insurance claims that had resulted in payouts over the years. While none had led to criminal findings, they helped establish a pattern alongside the evidence recovered from the fire scene. Keene's body was eventually found inside the house. He died from smoke inhalation after becoming trapped inside, and investigators ultimately concluded that the fire had been intentionally set, ending the scheme before any claim could be filed. A house fire brought Keene's latest scheme to an abrupt end. At Lake Havasu, a woman was about to learn that attention can be just as addictive as success. It was July 22nd, 2015. The afternoon sun reflected off the water at Lake Havasu, Arizona, where hundreds of people had gathered to enjoy a summer day on the lake. Cassandra Wynn was 34 and loved being the center of attention. Whether she was at a party, a family gathering, or a casual outing with friends, she usually found a way to make herself the focus of whatever was happening. The more people watched, the more energized she seemed to become. That afternoon, she was spending the day on the lake with several friends. Like many groups there, they had brought an inflatable tube designed to be pulled behind a speedboat. Throughout the afternoon, different people took turns riding while others watched from the boat.
As I see it, for most of the day, it was just a group of friends taking turns on the tube and having fun on the water.
Cassandra enjoyed it more than anyone. Whenever she took a turn on the tube, she wanted to stay on longer than everyone else. If someone else got a big reaction from the group, she wanted a bigger one. It wasn't enough to participate. She wanted people paying attention to her. As the afternoon went on, the rides became more energetic. Cassandra repeatedly asked for faster speeds and sharper turns whenever she was on the tube. Several friends eventually decided they had enough and spent the rest of the day relaxing on the boat instead. Hours later, the group began talking about heading back. The tubing was essentially finished. Most people were tired, sunburned, and ready to call it a day, but Cassandra wasn't. Before the boat left the area, she wanted one final ride. Not just another ride, her best ride. Friends helped her back onto the tube while the boat pulled away from the group. The lake had grown busier throughout the afternoon, and the water was noticeably rougher than it had been earlier in the day. Wakes from passing boats crisscrossed the surface, creating uneven conditions in multiple directions. The boat accelerated. Almost immediately, the tube began bouncing across the water. Cassandra held on as it skipped over one wake after another. The impacts grew harder as speed increased. Even then, she continued encouraging the driver to make the ride more exciting. The boat entered a wider section of open water and began a sharp turn. The tube swung outward. For a moment, Cassandra managed to stay on. Then the tube struck a large wake at an angle. One side lifted violently into the air while the other dug into the water. The sudden movement launched Cassandra from the inflatable and sent her tumbling across the surface.
She struck the water hard and never resurfaced. At first, I assumed it was the kind of routine wipeout that everyone would be laughing about a few moments later.
But after a while passed without seeing Cassandra come back up, the mood changed. The boat immediately turned around. As friends reached the area where she entered the water, they found her floating face down. A call for help was placed while people nearby pulled her from the lake and attempted to assist. Despite those efforts, she never regained consciousness. Photographs, videos, and statements collected from people who were there helped investigators reconstruct the final hours of Cassandra's day on the lake. Together, they showed that she had repeatedly asked for faster speeds and more aggressive turns throughout the afternoon, before insisting on one final ride after most people had already finished tubing and were preparing to head back. The examination determined that Cassandra suffered a severe head and neck injury when she struck the water after being thrown from the tube. The impact rendered her unconscious almost immediately, leaving her unable to keep herself afloat. She drowned before rescuers could reach her. The death was ultimately ruled an accident resulting from injuries sustained during a recreational boating activity.
A crowded lake became the setting for Cassandra's final mistake. Up in West Virginia, a man who claimed to be fully healed was about to find out whether that was actually true.
It was October 8, 2017. Cool autumn weather had settled over the Hatfield-McCoy Trail System in West Virginia, where miles of rugged ATV trails wound through forests, hills, and old mining roads. Riders from across the region had gathered to take advantage of the favorable conditions before winter arrived. Evan Maddox was 41 and hated feeling limited. Several months earlier, he had suffered a serious leg injury during a recreational accident. The injury wasn't life-threatening, but it required a lengthy recovery and forced him to put many of his favorite activities on hold. I can only imagine how frustrating the restrictions became for someone who was used to being active. As the months passed, Evan grew tired of talking about the injury. He insisted he was doing better and downplayed the weakness that still affected his leg. The recovery was progressing, but it wasn't complete. By the fall of 2017, he was determined to get back to normal. When friends invited him on an ATV ride through the Hatfield-McCoy trails, he saw it as a chance to prove the injury was finally behind him.
For the first few hours, Evan appeared to be doing fine. I think what he failed to anticipate was how demanding the terrain would become.
Rocky sections, deep ruts, and steep climbs required constant control of the ATV. Over time, fatigue began setting in. At a few stops, Evan quietly stretched his leg before climbing back onto the ATV. Even so, he continued riding. By early afternoon, the group entered a more challenging section of trail that wound through hilly terrain with loose dirt, exposed rocks, and deeper ruts carved by previous riders. As the trail narrowed, riders had to pay closer attention to their positioning and speed. Evan followed behind the others through the section. At one point, his ATV struck a series of uneven ruts that caused the vehicle to bounce aggressively. Normally, a rider would compensate by shifting body weight and making quick adjustments to stay in control. Evan tried, but his injured leg didn't respond the way he expected. As the ATV bounced through another rut, the weakness in his leg made it difficult to stabilize himself. The vehicle drifted slightly off its intended line and toward the softer edge of the trail. For a moment, I thought Evan might regain control. The ATV tilted as it left the main track and entered uneven ground. Evan attempted to steer back onto the trail, but the maneuver shifted the vehicle's weight in the opposite direction. Within seconds, the ATV rolled. The machine flipped down a short embankment, throwing Evan from the seat before coming to rest several feet away. The riders ahead immediately stopped and rushed back toward the crash site. A call for help was placed as soon as it became clear how serious the situation was. Although the rollover occurred over a relatively short distance, the force involved was substantial. Evan suffered severe trauma when he was thrown from the ATV and struck the rocky terrain below. Despite rescue efforts, he succumbed to his injuries before he could be transported from the trail. After the crash, investigators reviewed Evan's medical records and recovery timeline from the months leading up to the ride. The records showed that his injured leg had improved but had not fully recovered. Friends and relatives also described how he had gradually stopped talking about the injury altogether, often insisting he was ready to return to normal activities long before his recovery was complete. The medical examination found that Evan died from multiple blunt force injuries sustained during the ATV rollover. No mechanical problems were found with the vehicle, and the trail conditions were consistent with normal off-road riding. The death was ruled accidental, with investigators concluding that the lingering effects of his earlier leg injury likely contributed to the loss of control that led to the crash. Evan's mistake came from believing his body was ready when it wasn't. Several states away, a stranded vehicle would give one man the opportunity to play hero. It was May 14th, 2016. The afternoon sun hung over U.S. Route 50 outside Ely, Nevada, where long stretches of highway cut through open desert and rugged mountain terrain. Traffic was light, and drivers could often go several minutes without seeing another vehicle. Kyle Edmond was 38 and rarely passed up an opportunity to lend a hand. Whether someone needed help moving furniture, fixing a problem, or dealing with an unexpected setback, he usually volunteered before anyone asked. Most of the time, that made him the kind of person people appreciated having around. That afternoon, Kyle was driving home from a work trip when he spotted a pickup truck parked on the shoulder with its hazard lights flashing. The driver was standing nearby, waiting. Kyle pulled over. At first, there was nothing unusual about that.
I mean, yeah, Plenty of people stop to check if someone needs help, especially on a remote highway where services can be far apart.
The driver explained that the truck had developed a mechanical problem and could no longer continue safely. More importantly, he had already contacted roadside assistance and was simply waiting for help to arrive. For most people, that would have been the end of the conversation. For Kyle, it wasn't. He looked over the vehicle and quickly began offering suggestions. The driver explained that help was already on the way, but Kyle remained interested. The longer he looked at the truck, the more convinced he became that the situation could be handled without waiting. After several minutes, Kyle suggested moving the truck farther from the roadway. The driver initially hesitated. The truck was already off the main travel lane, and professional help had already been requested. But after discussing it further, he eventually agreed to move the vehicle a short distance to what they believed would be a safer position. The plan seemed simple. The truck would be rolled a short distance across the shoulder while being guided into a flatter area away from passing traffic. The repositioning started without any issues. The truck began moving slowly across the uneven ground. Kyle positioned himself alongside the vehicle, walking beside it as it rolled forward and guiding the driver around uneven sections of the shoulder while keeping an eye on the terrain ahead. What neither man fully appreciated was how unstable the shoulder had become. The ground consisted of loose gravel, compacted dirt, and shallow depressions created by years of weather and traffic. Under the truck's weight, conditions changed quickly. As the vehicle rolled forward, one of its tires dropped into a rut. The truck shifted unexpectedly. The sudden movement caused the vehicle to lean slightly toward Kyle's side. For a brief moment, it looked like the shift was minor and would correct itself. Instead, the truck continued moving unevenly across the loose shoulder. Kyle reacted immediately and tried to steady himself while staying alongside the vehicle. At the same time, he attempted to keep pace with the truck as it rolled forward, but the unstable ground beneath him made that difficult. His foot slipped on the loose gravel. He stumbled once, then again. Before he could regain his balance, he fell directly into the truck's path. The driver attempted to stop the vehicle, but there wasn't enough time. The truck rolled over Kyle before finally coming to a stop several feet away. The truck's driver immediately reached for his phone and called for emergency assistance. Other motorists soon pulled over after noticing people gathered along the shoulder, but the severity of Kyle's injuries left little anyone could do.
I think it's important to point out that the situation Kyle encountered was never an emergency to begin with.
The truck's driver had already called for roadside assistance and was safely waiting for help when Kyle pulled over. Kyle died from severe crush injuries sustained when the truck rolled over him. The fatal injuries occurred while the vehicle was being repositioned, a step that had not been necessary for the driver's safety. The death was ultimately ruled an accident. Trying to be the hero cost Kyle his life. In rural Ohio, another man would create his own problem when he decided to tear down a structure he didn't even own. It was August 27, 2014. The late summer heat lingered over a rural area outside Chillicothe, Ohio, where scattered properties, old barns, and aging commercial buildings dotted the landscape. Many of the structures had stood for decades, and some had long since fallen into disrepair. Roger Douglas was 52 and had very little patience for waiting. If something wasn't getting done as quickly as he thought it should, he often started looking for ways to handle it himself. For months, Roger had been frustrated by a deteriorating building located near property he frequently visited. The structure had been vacant for years and had become an eyesore in his opinion. There was one obvious problem. The building didn't belong to him. Roger had no ownership interest in the property and no authority to make decisions about it. Even so, he became increasingly convinced that something needed to be done. Over time, the idea shifted from frustration to action. Rather than reporting concerns or leaving the matter alone, Roger began discussing ways the structure could be removed altogether. Eventually, he settled on what he believed would be the quickest solution. He would bring it down himself. Roger had no formal demolition training and no meaningful experience with explosives. Nevertheless, he convinced himself that a small abandoned structure couldn't be that difficult to demolish. He believed that placing explosive material inside the building would weaken key supports and trigger a controlled collapse. On the afternoon of August 27, he arrived at the property and began putting his plan into motion. The building itself was already in poor condition. Portions of the roof had deteriorated, sections of the interior were unstable, and debris was scattered throughout parts of the structure. Roger entered carrying several sticks of commercial blasting material he intended to use for the demolition. Inside, he spent time positioning them in locations where he believed they would cause the greatest structural damage.
Without engineering knowledge or demolition experience, those decisions were based largely on guesswork. which I can tell you could be really dangerous.
At some point while Roger was still inside, making final adjustments to the placement of the charges, one of the blasting caps appears to have activated prematurely. The blast sent debris flying and caused sections of the structure to collapse almost immediately. The force of the explosion knocked him off his feet as debris tore through the interior. Almost immediately, sections of the already weakened structure began giving way. Portions of the roof collapsed first, followed by support beams and interior walls that crashed down around him. Within seconds, large sections of the building had fallen into the area where Roger had been working. Dust filled the air, reducing visibility as debris continued falling throughout the structure. People nearby reported hearing a loud blast and seeing debris rise above the property. When responders arrived, they found significant structural damage throughout the building. Access to parts of the site was difficult because portions of the structure had become unstable after the explosion. Roger was eventually located within the debris. He had suffered catastrophic injuries during the blast and collapse. Evidence recovered from the scene showed that Roger had been attempting to demolish the structure himself despite having no ownership of the property and no formal demolition training. Investigators believe the premature detonation occurred while he was still handling or adjusting the demolition setup. Materials associated with the attempted demolition were found throughout the building, helping establish a clear picture of what had occurred. Roger died from severe traumatic injuries sustained during the explosion and subsequent structural collapse. The death was ruled an accident.
Some problems become dangerous when people insist on solving them alone. For the last story, a seasoned boater thought that rough conditions were something that he could handle himself.
It was June 19, 2018. A gray morning settled over Newport, Oregon, where the Pacific Ocean stretched beyond a rugged coastline known for rapidly changing conditions. Fishing boats moved through Yaquina Bay and into open water, but strong winds and growing swells had already convinced some boaters to stay closer to shore. Craig Ellison was 49 and had spent years fishing along the Oregon coast. Friends often described him as stubborn once he committed to a plan. If he set aside a day for a fishing trip, he rarely liked cutting it short, especially after spending time preparing for it. On the morning of June 19, Craig planned to spend several hours fishing offshore in a small recreational boat. Before leaving the harbor, he had already noticed the conditions. Winds were stronger than expected, and the water outside the bay looked rough. Several other boaters had chosen to postpone their trips or remain closer to protected waters, but Craig wasn't ready to give up on the day. The boat cleared the harbor entrance and continued into open water. The swells were larger than normal, but still manageable. For a while, the trip unfolded much the way Craig expected. As the morning continued, however, conditions gradually worsened. Wind speeds increased. Waves became steeper. The boat began rising and falling more aggressively as it moved through the swells. Even then, Craig stayed offshore. Rather than turning back, he continued fishing and periodically repositioned the boat in search of better conditions. By early afternoon, the ocean looked considerably different than it had that morning. The swells had grown larger, and the distance between them became less predictable. Several waves began breaking in ways that made operating a small vessel increasingly difficult. Craig finally decided it was time to head back. By then, he faced a much more challenging trip than the one he had taken earlier. As the boat moved toward shore, it encountered a series of larger swells. The vessel climbed each wave before dropping sharply into the trough behind it. Every impact sent vibrations through the hull and forced Craig to make constant steering corrections. By that point, he had already spent hours dealing with the conditions, and the constant adjustments were becoming increasingly demanding. For a time, he managed. Then a larger wave approached from behind. The swell lifted the boat higher than the previous waves and pushed it forward as it began descending the opposite side. As Craig attempted to maintain control, another wave arrived moments later from a slightly different angle. The combination unsettled the vessel and the boat rolled sharply. Water washed across part of the deck as the vessel leaned to one side.
Craig attempted to counter the movement and bring the boat back into position, but believe me, rough conditions left very little room for error here.
Before the boat could fully recover, another wave struck. The vessel capsized. Within seconds, Craig found himself in cold, turbulent water several miles from shore. The overturned boat remained nearby, but rough conditions made movement difficult. Large swells repeatedly separated him from the vessel. Strong winds continued pushing both the boat and the surrounding water farther apart. A distress call was eventually received, and a search effort began. But locating a person in rough ocean conditions is never simple. Visibility was limited by waves, and the search area expanded as time passed. Craig was recovered later that day. Weather observations, vessel information, and the timeline of the trip helped establish how conditions had changed throughout the day. The information showed that winds and swells had steadily increased after Craig left shore, creating increasingly difficult conditions for a small recreational boat. The examination determined that Craig died from drowning after the vessel overturned in rough seas. The death was ruled an accident, with deteriorating marine conditions identified as a major contributing factor.